So I'm going to teach you how to do English paper piecing, and these are some of the common tools that I personally use. I know other people may use something a little different, and you'll build your own style as you go. The main components are the actual English paper pieced hexagons if you're doing a hexagon shape. Now, I buy mine from an online retailer because I don't like cutting my own out, but it's your personal preference if you want to cut yours out. I would do it with a thicker paper, like something you can use over and over again, because these that I buy, they're die cut, so they're precisely cut, and I can use them more than once because they're thicker. They're a little more sturdy. They're not thin like paper. They hold up better over time. For this particular size paper piece, I use 2.5-inch squares of fabric. So I have these already cut out. I use a die cutter on my AccuQuilt Go to cut these out. Before I was just cutting from strips, and that's fine too. But you just need to cut out your 2.5-inch squares of fabric, whatever colors you want, and you can go from there. I have a seam ripper. My needle, I tend to use something along the lines of a size 8 sharp. It goes through the fabric better and doesn't leave a big mess at the end. So for thread, I'm just going to show you the thread basting portion right now. We're not going to be sewing anything together in this particular video. So for thread basting onto the hexagon, you can use pretty much any thread that you want. I use threads that I want to get rid of that I'm not going to use in actual sewing. So this is some quilting thread that I purchased, and I figured out was too linty for actual quilting thread. So I'm using it up in my thread basting, because when you thread baste, you're going to be removing all of those pieces of thread afterwards. I have lots of pins. I like the small pins, the small sharp pins, to go into my hexagons. They will come out once it's thread basted, but it tends to hold really well, and they're not so long that they get in the way of the fabric being folded over the edges. You'll see what I mean. And then some scissors or thread nippers. I like these because they're small. Thimble is optional. I don't always use it. I usually use it when I'm sewing hexagons together. For thread basting, I don't normally need it unless I have some fabric that is not cooperating very well. So the first thing that you're going to do is take one of your hexagons and your pieces of fabric, and you're going to kind of center it onto the fabric. And then you're going to put a pin right in there, right in the middle. Alright, and then if you don't have your needle already threaded, then go ahead and do that. I happen to have mine done. And I like to start at the point of the hexagon where there isn't a lot of fabric. If you happen to not pin in the exact center, try to start there so you don't end up with this one corner that is really hard to get a stitch through. So I just fold over a corner, try to get it tight against that crease, and then I fold over another corner, and you want a nice little point, like that. Now I'm just going to run my needle through it, under the fold, and then coming out on top of the fold. And I don't knot my thread when I'm thread basting. It tends to take up a lot of time, and I want to do it as quick as possible. So I'm going to do that one more time, under the fold, and coming out right on top. And I'm going to run it through that same direction again to kind of anchor my stitch in. My thread's knotting a little bit. That's okay. Alright. So I'm just going to trim that. If your thread knots in this portion, it's not a big deal. In fact, it kind of helps to anchor it a little bit better. But you don't want, you know, a ton of stuff in the back because you're going to be eventually trimming this out of the way. Now I'm going to kind of work backwards. I'm right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you're going to have to do this opposite from me. But what I do is I folded that corner the same way that I folded the first corner. And now I'm going to turn it back towards me. I'm going to run the stitch backwards. So starting on the folded side, I'm coming out on the other side. If you're having to push your needle through very, very hard, that means you're going through the paper, and you don't want to sew through the paper. You want to only sew through the actual fabric. Pull it tight. Sometimes I tuck that in a little bit. You're going to go to the next corner, fold it. I hold it down with my nail just to kind of give it a nice crease. And then I do another stitch. Fold, and stitch that through. Once you get the knack at this, you can do this pretty quickly. I've got the camera in my way, so I'm not as comfortable as I normally am doing this, but I usually sit in front of my television and I watch a movie, and I'll have a stack of fabric that needs to be thread basted for my grandmother's flower garden quilt, and I'll just whip them right out, and I'll do either colors or a whole bunch of fabric all at one time. It depends on what section of my quilt that I'm working on. Alright, and when you get to the last portion, I'm just going to trim this thread so it's not in my way. You're just going to run a backward stitch through that beginning area just to kind of make sure it's held. And if you want, you can knot it, but I find when you go to actually remove them, it becomes difficult. So now I'm going to trim my thread, and I'm going to take out my pin. And that is the end result, the thread basted hexagon. And you can see on the other side, you've got nice corners, and your edges are nice and clean. And if you press this with an iron, it will look perfect. So I don't like to do individual stitches through here. I find that mine are just as sturdy, stitching at each fold of each point of the hexagon, and it holds up just fine. So that's thread basting.